Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to come today to discuss this delightful painting, John McStanley's Indian Council to Wakena Creek, Texas. I want to look closely at it to examine its subject, its historical context, and even I think its relevance for today. I think that a work of art can be a wonderful tool to open a world of ideas. Indian Council to Wakena Creek, Texas is a rare visual document of early Texas history that portrays an important moment. As a structure, I'm going to look today at the sort of journalistic view of the subject, who, what, where, when, and why of this painting. So we'll start looking at the Indian Council to Wakena Creek, Texas, and I'll break it down by looking at different people involved in the subject of this painting. And we'll start with the artist himself, John McStanley. I have a detail on the right that shows what we believe is a self-portrait of Stanley, drawing as he looks on a scene of an Indian standing on a blasted tree. Next to him is another man in very similar clothing. And I believe that this is likely his business partner, a man named Caleb Sumner Dickerman, who assisted Stanley in his art endeavors. Stanley and Dickerman formed this partnership so that they could work together for Stanley's dream of portraying Indian portraits. Dickerman wrote to the Secretary of War of the United States asking permission for the two to travel to frontier military posts to make portraits of the most prominent chiefs of various Indian tribes. And in his letter, he referred to the influence of the work of George Catlin, which then Stanley, of course, intended to surpass. I do want to give a little background as Stanley himself, because in knowing about the creator, we know the viewpoints that are brought to the image. I talk about to Wakena Creek as a historical document, but it nevertheless has the viewpoints of its creator. On the left is a photographic portrait of John McStanley about 1853, about 10 years after the painting of Indian Council to Wakena Creek. But I wanted to be able to show you a daguerreotype, which was an early photographic technique. And Stanley was, in essence, an early adapter, and he used daguerreotypes in his studies for his portraits, and he also had himself recorded. Early in his career, Stanley began his artistic work really as a sign painter. He was born in Canandaigua, New York. As an occupation, he was a wagon maker and sign painter, and then moved to Detroit, Michigan, where he began painting portraits. That was a logical transition for sign painters. He perhaps received some training, but throughout his career, he was essentially self-taught. He traveled around making portraits of the settlers in the area that we know, the Midwest. And on the right is a reproduction of one of his paintings of William Hempstead as a boy. Family commissioned a portrait of their young son, and you see that Stanley did a rather ambitious portrait of William Hempstead, showing the boy with in an outdoor setting with his faithful dog and some of his other tools, on the ground a horn, and in his arms a whip of some type. We see as well the beginning stylistic development of Stanley. The portrait is somewhat stilted, a little like a folk art painting, somewhat flat in the modeling, but nevertheless a likeness that certainly pleased the family in their representation of their young son. And so it was this type of portrait that Stanley did for several years, but he wanted to go beyond commissioned portraiture and have a mission of his own to paint subjects of Indians. And in that, he was influenced by the work and the career of George Catlin, who in the 1830s had traveled from the East Coast out to the far West on several journeys, painting portraits and scenes of life of Indian people. They did some 500 works, which he then often duplicated, as we see in the portrait on the left of Matotopa and his wife. And Stanley believed his work had value, not only as individual works, but as the whole. His collection of some 500 portraits providing a complete Indian gallery to preserve the likenesses and the life of people who he felt their life was passing away. He circulated his Indian gallery and tried to get the U.S. government to purchase it. In the book illustration on the right, we see his Indian gallery in the background as Catlin traveled in Europe doing demonstrations of Indian life in conjunction with exhibiting the Indian gallery. And that inspiration of creating a complete presentation of Indian peoples, as well as showing their traditional ways of life by going out and living and working among the people, inspired Stanley and led to that trip to Waukena Creek, as well as time in the Indian Territory, where he did later in 1843 this painting of another Indian council. It was very important for Stanley to present himself as a purveyor of authentic works of art, and thus he traveled. And in this pencil self-portrait, very faint, I hope you can see the outline, he shows himself, he called it My Prairie Home, with the implements that he needed as he traveled. We have a little camp stool in which he's written his name. So it serves both as a signature and an identification of the artist as working artist. Two very important expeditions provided John McStanley with employment, as well as access to new subjects and information about a variety of Indian tribes. In 1846, he served as an artist traveling with the U.S. Army during the war with Mexico. And on the slide on the left is San Felipe, New Mexico, one of the oil sketches that Stanley did while he was essentially an artist embedded with the Army. He traveled from New Mexico to the California region, observing at the end battles, but this was a time as the United States wrested more territory from Mexico. Stanley's sketches served as illustrations for a written account, and they were also really an inventory of the territory. After the time with the war with Mexico, he traveled more on his own, including a trip to Hawaii. And then his second major expedition was to accompany a survey mapping out a possible route for a transcontinental railroad. And the slide on the right is one of the published illustrations of a drawing that Stanley worked on for the final report. He traveled along a route that would have been a northern route for a possible transcontinental railway. Thus, through these two expeditions, he had firsthand knowledge of the United States' intention to acquire more territory and also to promote transportation and commerce across the continent, and bringing in more population, which would continue to displace indigenous subjects. Along the way, he besides the assigned tasks he had, He gathered more images for more formal paintings, such as this beautiful work of Black Knife and the Apache Warrior, which he did based on a subject he saw in New Mexico, a Chiricahua Apache Indian. And you can see the technical skill that he has gained in just a few years of very active drawing and painting. Stanley had gathered enough works together that he had developed his own Indian gallery. And in 1852, he began exhibiting it at the new Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And we have here a stereoptic view of the picture gallery in the Smithsonian, where Stanley's paintings hung alongside those of Charles Bird King. And I think that a number of Stanley's works are in the background on the right, and Charles Bird King portraits on the left. Stanley was attempting to interest the United States government in purchasing his collection, and he put it on loan at the Smithsonian with the hope that that would inspire the Congress to purchase. He made several petitions, was never successful in convincing them that it would be valuable for the nation to acquire this collection of diverse portraits of Indian peoples. And unfortunately for Stanley, in 1865, there was a fire at the Smithsonian building, and his collection and that of Charles Bird King were, both of those were destroyed in this fire, with a few exceptions. About 5 paintings from Stanley's collection survived the fire and are today in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So they eventually ended up being part of the government's art collection, but not much to the benefit of Stanley himself. During the time that he was exhibiting at the Smithsonian, he settled down and married Alice Caroline English, a young school teacher. And again, they had their portraits made as a daguerreotype. They would have 5 children, only 2 of whom lived to adulthood, a daughter Edith and a son Lewis Crandall, who's Lewis Crandall's daughter Alice Stanley, and then married, named Atchison, avidly collected her grandfather's work and built up a collection. Many of the works were purchased by H.J. Lutcher Stark from Alice Atchison for his planned gallery, which has become the Stark Museum of Art. And among those paintings is this beautiful late painting that Stanley did in 1867. So he continued painting Indian subjects after his tragedy. He moved to Detroit, and you can see late in his career the success he reaches artistically in combining intricate detail and a beautifully balanced composition and a heroic presentation of essentially a genre scene, as Indians in full regalia play a game of cards where they are gambling for the deer in the lower left-hand corner. It's quite a dramatic artistic change from his early works, especially Indian Council, which we, having explored the career of Stanley, we're going to go back and look at the other figures represented in the subject. Stanley and Dickerman came to this council in the company of one Pierce Mason Butler, who was the U.S. Indian agent to the Cherokee people in Indian Territory, what's now the state of Oklahoma. He was tasked with establishing relations with the Cherokee. We believe that Pierce Mason Butler is the central figure in the European style clothing in the middle of the circle. at this point in Stanley's career and with this particular composition, I don't find that there are enough distinctions in the facial representations to really find portraits. I'll show you in a moment an earlier portrait of Pierce Mason Butler. But I think the history of this particular painting argues for the centrality of Pierce Mason Butler. This painting was owned by Butler himself, and it descended through his family until the Stark Museum was fortunate enough to be able to acquire it. It was probably commissioned by Butler, and that he requested Stanley to do a scene. And usually the person who commissions a painting will have a prominent position in it, if that's the appropriate subject. And that's the centrality of that central figure argues for it being Pierce Mason Butler. We also have a newspaper account that Butler requested another painting be done by Stanley. So they did have a relationship of artistic cooperation. Butler was quoted as speaking in the Indian Council that took place. And he said, "I've come a long way to witness this treaty of peace and friendship." He told about the President of the United States sending him to, quote, "to try to bury the tomahawk and unstring the war bow," the kind of flowery language that is recorded occurring during this Indian Council. This is a rather elegant portrait of the somewhat younger Pierce Butler. He began his career as a military officer, serving in the U.S. Army, resigned and later became governor of South Carolina for several years, and then was appointed as Indian agent to the Cherokee. In the late 1840s, he resigned to re-enlist in the Army, and he served in the U.S. Army during the war with Mexico, which unfortunately he died in battle in Mexico. So somewhat young into his lifetime. But throughout his life, he served faithfully the people of South Carolina and is memorialized in the State House. The other Anglo people represented in the painting would have to be the representatives of the nation, the Republic of Texas. We find their names in historical documents. There were at least 3 commissioners and several witnesses who, and probably other members of their parties who were at the Indian Council. We see them arrayed on the logs, wearing very formal clothing, the dark suits, white shirts or ties, often with top hats. Again, we have some indication of the facial features, but not enough to distinguish individuals. And although we have the names of 3 commissioners, I wasn't able to locate portraits of them, so nothing to compare. But knowing the names and somewhat the histories of the 3 commissioners, there was George Whitfield Terrell, who came to Texas from Tennessee and was eventually appointed as Attorney General for Texas, and appointed by Sam Houston, president, and then later became an Indian commissioner. There was John S. Black, who was a Texas colonist, fought in the Texas Revolution, San Jacinto, and continued to serve in positions after the war. Sam Houston appointed him as an Indian commissioner, and then he later served as diplomat to European nations during the time that Texas was a republic. And finally, Thomas Ingalls Smith who came to Texas right after the Battle of San Jacinto, but enlisted in the Army of the Texas Republic and also was a Texas Ranger. And one of the notable historical moments for Smith, he was appointed by Sam Houston to move the archives of the Republic of Texas from Austin down to Houston, where Sam Houston wanted the capital to be. Unfortunately, the citizens of Austin resisted ferociously, and Smith and his other rangers had to give up their mission during what has become known as the Archives War of Texas. Who knew that archives could cause such a fierce battle? But seemingly, Thomas Ingalls Smith's failure at moving the archives didn't cause too much displeasure with Sam Houston. He also was appointed a commissioner to the Indians. Commissioner Terrell addressed the council saying, "Our business is to remove all causes of war and establish peace among us." And of course, the other major governmental group was the Indian peoples, and actually there were several Indian nations represented. They were not just one generic group of Indians. We have from the documents, we have the names of the different nations, and as well as from the signatories, identities of individual chiefs who signed agreements. There were the Delaware, Shawnee, Caddo, Iowa, Anadarko, Waukene, Waco, Wichita, and Keechee. The Delaware or Lenape were originally Eastern indigenous people. They were pushed west by settlement and came into Texas in roughly the 1820s. The Delaware are now the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma. The Shawnee were Woodlands people, roughly what today is Kentucky, and they migrated to Missouri and then down to Texas in the 1820s. They petitioned Mexico for their own land. The Shawnee now are the Shawnee tribe in Oklahoma. The Caddo were indigenous to Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana area. Today, they are the Caddo Nation in Oklahoma. The Ione and the Anadarko both related to Caddo and are indigenous to East Texas. The Anadarko were pushed out of Texas under Mirabeau Lamar, came back in 1843, but today they are part of the Caddo Nation with other tribes. And the Tawakoni, Waco, Wichita, and Keechee are all people related of Central and Southern Plains who migrated into Texas and now part of the Wichita and affiliated tribes of Oklahoma. We have both the participants of the council as well as figures on horseback. In the background, we have scenes of everyday life. So we have some of the community. Sorry. I just want to draw your attention to this figure. It's very hard to see in this slide, but in person you can see the faint appearance of what seems to be a red headband around the figure. It's a simple plain headband in the Indian Council painting, but I think it may be related to the next image. Stanley at the Indian Council painted portraits of individuals made sketches. We believe that this sketch is one of the surviving early efforts that he made. And from its style and presentation, it was likely done in 1843. It might have been done at this Indian Council. It might have been done later. But I'd like to associate it with the man wearing the red headband in the full painting of the Indian Council. An anthropologist has addressed the subject and believes he is either Delaware or Cherokee. So Delaware, he could have been at the 1843 Tawakana Council. In the portrait sketch, we can really see that even at this point, when Stanley was working in a format that he was familiar with, that of portraiture, he's able to convey more accurately representation of features and give some idea of the expression. We don't know the identity of this figure. There were at least 6 Delaware Indians who were represented finally in Stanley's Indian Gallery, but there's not enough information about those missing paintings to associate it with this. At the moment, his identity will remain a mystery. There are other sketches that survive, one of which in another collection, the Yale University Art Collection, is identified in the inscription. He is Bin Ta, the wounded man, and we do know that Stanley painted a larger version. Bin Ta was the principal chief of the Caddos, and written in the catalog that accompanied the Indian Gallery, it was said that he derived his name from the fact of having been wounded in the breast by an Osage. He wears a piece of silver suspended from his nose as an ornament. Bin Ta was one of the speakers at the Indian Council, and one of the things he said in his speech, "I believe what you have told me is truth, and henceforth we are all friends." So he spoke on behalf of the Caddo people in friendship. Another surviving pencil sketch by Stanley is identified in the inscription as Jim Connor, and it is likely the person identified in the minutes and documents associated with the council as John Connor. John Connor was part of the Delaware contingent. As you see, he has an anglicized name. And he served as an interpreter for the Delaware during the council, and was from the implication of his name was partially Anglo and partially Delaware. He's an important figure who bridges the Texians, the United States, and then the Indian people. And I think that this sketch helps us to suggest a possible identification for the figures speaking with Pierce Mason Butler. The type of fringed coat and the leggings worn by the figure on the left are very similar to the clothing worn by Jim or John Connor, and the sketch, and somewhat similar to the figure on the right as well. Their differentiation from most of the other subjects places them in a new position, and the centrality, I think, indicates the importance of interpretation and communication that is taking place at this council. So those were some of the people who were there, but who was not there. Well, Sam Houston was not there, the president of the Texas Republic, the man who called this council together, who wanted to reverse the policies of his immediate predecessor. Houston had served as the first elected president of the Republic of Texas, but he was not able to succeed himself. And so the second president was Mirabeau B. Lamar. Houston and Lamar had some very different approaches to policies, and particularly in relation to the Indian people. Houston had wanted to negotiate. Lamar was a fierce antagonist in his Indian policy. He wanted to remove most of the Indian people from Texas, and his tenure saw increased warring conflict. So when he was not able to extend his term, Sam Houston was reelected. In his second term, he moved for more reconciliation, inviting Indian people to remain on their lands, and wanted more peace. Also, the Cherokee people didn't come to the conference and were not officially represented, nor were the Comanche, two of the tribes it was very important to negotiate with. So both of these lacks, even though Houston supported, he was not personally there. And I think that affected the outcome of the particular Indian Council. So we've looked at who. We want to look a little more at what, because I've referred a number of times to Indian Council, but I want to emphasize that it was a particular deliberative assembly. And Indian tribes were known for having councils for deliberation and resolution of conflict. We see here an etching by a work by Samuel Seymour, who on one of the first expeditions sponsored by the U.S. government was instructed to bring back, as well as portraits, scenes of Indian councils. It was part of the information that the U.S. government was trying to occur. Councils were often used specifically for treaties. James Otto Lewis represented an Indian count, or made actually several representations of Indian councils in the Northwest, Midwest. And we see again the circular composition of the council in this rather delightful image that really conveys the idea that this is a treaty for the U.S. government, with the rather large flag overflying the scene. John McStanley was able to bring his own interpretation of the council. He retains the main features, the circular gathering, the scenes of Indian life in the background, but we have that rather unique view of the artist himself sketching an Indian on that blasted tree. Perhaps in the dead and dying tree is often an indication of forthcoming foreboding, and I'm not sure, possibly that Stanley indicated the unhappy potential consequences of the council and future Indian history. The where of the Indian Council is, of course, we've learned that from the title, the Tawakanac Creek. It is off of the Brazos River, as we see on this map of Texas that shows land grants to the Anglos. And it's below the city of what's now Waco, and here is Tawakanac Creek on the map. So it was an area that was mapped, and I'm going to show two different maps just to indicate that Texas was, there are different interpretations of what Texas is, even at this point in the Republic of Texas. This map shows not the land grants to the Anglos, but it shows territory of the Indian people. So we see Cherokee, Shawnee, Lipan Apache, down at the bottom, Coushatta. Oops. The when this takes place on Tuesday, 28th of March, 1843, right, in the period of the Republic of Texas, when Texas is a nation. However, Stanley's painting, we can see, actually precedes a few days, by a few days, the actual council. On the reverse of the painting is his rather flourished signature, J.M. Stanley, in the upper left, and then in the center, Texas, March 20th, 1843. Many of the participants in the council gathered early, and it's been posited that Stanley was painting sort of ahead of the game a scene of what should take place. And that's possible, but with the emphasis on the patron, I think Stanley was emphasizing the negotiations that needed to take place, the communication that needed to take place before the council even took place. And this brings us to the why of this Indian Council. And of course, we've intimated along the way that it is a treaty. Its goal was a treaty, and it was to negotiate peace, and it was to settle questions of land. So we represent on the left a scene of peace, because we have 3 flags of truce, the white flags of truce, which I interpret as one flag being for Indian people, the second for the state of Texas, and the third for the representation from the U.S. Pierce Mason Butler was there to represent the United States. But this was important as well for Texas, because there were many, and this would eventually happen, who wanted for Texas to be not its own nation, but to be part of the United States. So the United States had a strong interest, for many reasons, in what was occurring in Texas. The flag on the far left has some implements down at the bottom, what appears to be a knife, an item with a long pole and a rounded object, could be either tomahawk or a peace pipe. Smoking the pipe was part of the ritual of the Indian Council. But I think these implements possibly indicate that this flag was one of the flags to indicate the representation of the Indian people. The flag on the far right has a star that can be a single star that can be faintly seen on it. And of course, we all know the emblem of Texas is the Lone Star. And I think this flag indicates the Texian contingent. This third flag, I can't find any distinguishing characteristics. I have interpreted it to represent the third contingent of the U.S. government. But there are also textual references to Indian people bringing 2 flags. So it could be a question. I like the symbolism of the 3 parties, because peace was a goal for all of them. Although the settling of the land, the indigenous people who wanted to save their lands as a refuge, Aquacosh, the chief of the Waco, had said in the council, "The land I now stand on was once mine. The white man now owns it. My home is in the far west." I believe what my white brother has said, as long as the sun shines and the rivers run, we will be permitted to live in peace on the lands set apart for us. Did that happen? The council did not reach an official treaty, but agreed to talk more, as many meetings often result. On the left is printing from the official printed minutes of the council, March 31st, which concluded March 31st, 1843. And they agreed that there should be a grand council between the Republic of Texas and the tribes here represented and all other tribes. And it goes on to say that there will be peace under the white flag of truce until such council is convened. Eventually, as you see on the right, there was a treaty of in 1844 of peace, friendship, and commerce. And there were a couple more treaties immediately after this, which spoke of settlement and the conclusion of war. These treaties, however, were short-lived because in 1845, the United States annexed Texas, and federal relations with Indian nations is another story of more disruption and removal. But I believe that Stanley's painting gives us an opportunity to open up these stories of the past of Texas and its relations with Native peoples and learn more about the diverse peoples who had homes in Texas. Today, there are only 3 federally recognized tribes in the state of Texas, and yet there are another 29 recognized tribes or nations who have historical connections like the ones we've looked at today. I think Stanley's painting is a message of hope and patience. It represents the possibilities of peace among the difficulties of negotiation. The right people have to be there, the right time has to occur, the agreements and trust have to be there. Then I think it places communication at the very center of the negotiating role, and with its emphasis on the interpreters. For John McStanley, it was a beginning to his career. As he proceeded, he developed his artistic skills. I hope in the same way that leaders of our world will develop their skills of communication and negotiation for peace and for agreements on homelands. Thank you.